Another video lecture. I just finished the St. Augustine, and now we're moving on to Machiavelli. So this is week 3. It's moving by very quickly. So again, the top of the prompt paper, we have the prompt. Does Machiavelli's writing style lead to a persuasive argument? Why or why not? So again, you're taking a position, and then you're going to defend it. Explain using relevant text as evidence. And I changed this from the second half of the reading. So what I'm going to do in these notes, and I've kind of modified the assignment, is Machiavelli kind of gives all these kind of hints, and it took me, 8 hours compiling this set of notes, and I was like, I'm not going to do this for the second half. I'll leave it for you guys to work through. So the way I envision is we can talk about all of the readings, but I'll kind of work you through the Machiavellian method, and then you will find essentially these advice that he gives that you will determine whether it's persuasive or not. And, I would say, again, maybe find one that is persuasive and one that's not. You don't have to do that. You can just kind of find these useful tips. Machiavelli has his famous ones that are in our readings. Fortune favors the bold. Like, what does that mean? What's the other one he has? It's better to be feared than loved. Like, is that true? Like, are rulers more effective when people fear them as opposed to love them? And Machiavelli has his readings. And then his method is he'll give historical examples to kind of support his point, which is how I envision you defending your papers. And I have this addendum from last semester. If it helps, you can use contemporary examples, which I actually have a ton of these in this note set itself to help kind of prove or support his points, right? So again, there are no correct answers. There are only good or bad arguments that you produce, strong or weak arguments that you were going to produce. And the reason why I talk about this is, again, I could probably show, there's just one guy I don't like. He's like a motivational speaker. He's an idiot. But a lot of this kind of corporate America uses Machiavelli. Even when I typed it in, there were Trump stuff with regards to Machiavelli. And the reason why is that these kind of figures that think about power, so he's talking about politics and kind of the Renaissance period of Italy, a bunch of little city-states, and we're kind of coming into the modern era of nation-states. And he's talking about people actually in charge of a city or actually governing and wielding militaries and things like that. But people have taken the work of Machiavelli and applied it to, say, the business, because business, right, is a competition. You can see big companies as kind of like countries competing against each other, so Ford and GM or something like that. And it's not just Machiavelli. There's other sets of thinkers that, I think I would have added if I could make the class. I had a question about that today. Why do we have the readings we have? And I think the other two that you guys might want to do if you're kind of into this kind of logic is Sun Tzu's The Art of War. It's kind of Chinese thought on, again, military, but people apply it to human relationships or human psychology. And a Japanese samurai, Miyamoto Musashi, talks about these things too. I like the Musashi a little bit better because it talks more about the individual, but people like the Sun Tzu. It kind of talks about collective human action. So just food for thought. And again, Machiavelli is one of those thinkers. So what I have are quotes, different aspects of sections. I think what should be 1 through 14, whatever it is, 1 through 13, 1 through 14. I always get my Roman numerals messed up. So I have 1 through 13. I think it's 1 through 14, but it's neither here nor there. Read what the syllabus says to do. So here we have this first kind of from section 4, actually, or section 6. I think it's supposed to be 4. I suck at this, man, every time. Pretty sure it's section 4. A wise man ought always to follow, so again, people, again, we have this kind of inherent sexism in the readings. A wise man ought always follow the path beaten by great men, and to imitate those who have been supreme, so that if his ability does not equal theirs, at least it will savor of it. So I guess taste or be similar to it. Let him act like the clever archer who, designing to hit the mark which yet appears too far distant, and knowing the limits of which their strength of their bow attains, take aim much higher than the mark, not to reach by their strength or the arrow to so great a height, but to be able, with the aid of the height, right? So you're using gravity. It's an analogy or an allegory. Hit the mark that one hits, right? So we may not have the skills or the abilities or resources that great people in history have had, but this is why, like people like Oprah or President Obama or even President Trump are going to write books so that we can read those things and then we go, oh, okay, I see how they did it, and we can model ourselves after them, even if we don't necessarily have their money or resources to do the things they did. So I think that's kind of a good kind of way of understanding the prince. Some people say he's like the first kind of political scientist, which we'll talk about. Again, I'm moving through these things quickly. They're just kind of help food for thought for you all. So Machiavelli's work is an unromantic look at politics of the world in which he lived, right? So this is very different than the politicians we have today. Both Democrats and Republicans running for political office, they're both going to improve the economy. But I guess it could both be true, but they're going to have competing policies. So why are they always kind of giving the best picture of things? Because they want to win political power, right? Which again, these kind of precepts might be Machiavellian in a sense. But Machiavelli's not romantic. He'll talk about killing people, which we'll see in a second, if that gets you power. He's not going to obfuscate kind of like the things you have to do to be successful when doing this kind of like real politics, right? So it's like kind of Game of Thrones. House of Cards is a British show, but it's like an American show on Netflix. Kind of does this as well. But then there was like controversy over the head guy, I guess. So Machiavelli is trying to analyze or attempting to analyze historical cases of rulership in a systematic way in order to distill out the useful information. As such, Machiavelli is considered one of the first political scientists, as I kind of said. But it's key to note here, he's not using the scientific method. He's not using a hypothesis and then providing data and being able to have his information replicated. He's just kind of saying, look, here's an observation. It seems to make sense because there are these X, Y, and Z historical cases. But again, for our papers, there's going to be A, B, and C historical cases that maybe don't prove his point, right? So he's kind of giving a very selective interpretation of history. And obviously, he's not going to know all the history or know our history. So he uses the word the prince. We can just interpret that as anyone ruling or in charge of something. So the CEO of a company could be considered a prince, I think, in our modern sense. It is meant to be a guidebook for people in positions of power to utilize. Hence why people basically still reference this book if you get into corporate America. Let's see, from section 1, let's see, let's go through this stuff. So he's going to talk about different kinds of organizations of people with which people rule over. So again, context, I guess, matters. The reading starts off with the observation of governance of his day. Force of arms is a key tool in securing meaningful political power. So having a mastery of the martial arts, right, in this case, no military activity, is of critical importance for a successful leader. You can already note Machiavelli is not trying to establish an ideal political society, right? So it's not, again, we had people sharing their views or kind of these anarchic views about the world or the state. Like Machiavelli is just assuming a state. He's assuming people are going to use coercive power, and he's assuming the worst of people as well. He's not going to risk the benevolence of other people. He's going to assume the worst and prepare for the worst. And then he considers, what if you kind of get inherited your country or your city-state? How would you rule? What happens when you kind of have this mixed kind of cultural society that you take over in some capacity? Like they're going to be different things you're going to have to do to be successful. Let's see. He says in section 3, in this way you have enemies in all those whom you have injured in seizing the principality. And you are not to be able to keep those friends who put you there because you are not being able to satisfy them in the way they expected. And you cannot take strong measures against them, right? Feeling bound to them. For although one may be very strong in armed forces, yet entering a province, one has always need of goodwill of the natives. So again, we've had military conflicts. We're going to start getting to some of my pictures and examples that I can talk about right now. But yeah, you want to have the stability that we read about in the last readings. So you don't want people to have an uprising against you, because even if they're weak and don't have guns, they outnumber you. You're one person or you're a small collective ruling body. And even if you have all the military arms, if the people rise up, there's no way you can beat them, right? Maybe. I guess if you're like very cynical or pro-tyranny, you're like, oh, just shoot more bullets. Something like that. Last September, they had to run against Area 51, right? There were some simulations online that were pretty funny, so people could get in, right? Because it just swarmed the gates. The quotation above is a good example of this kind of typical political dilemma Machiavelli is analyzing. When a new person comes to power, they face different and competing challenges. Undoubtedly, as the prince used force to gain control, they would have harmed even accidentally innocent bystanders. So again, I think even though we're not really going to talk about, maybe in class we can, non-violent protest or the use of non-violence, right? In the sense of like Gandhi or Dr. King, where you preserve the moral higher ground, because that way you don't technically harm people in the way that you would if you conquer people through force, right? So again, legitimacy is a theme here that Machiavelli is aware of, but he thinks about it in a much more strategic kind of way, as instead of like a moral good in itself to obtain political legitimacy. Goodness qua goodness from class, if you were there on Tuesday of week 1. So these people will resent the ruler for the harm caused, and the ruler will use resources to win their loyalty back or gain it, I guess, over time, right? So you just kind of create enemies when you take over a new place. I guess to make this in class, we probably would have been an assignment. I could probably in the future make this not a paper, but I have people basically in class. We talk about ways in which we can apply this to the modern world, right? So if you guys have ever had a job, like a lot of times when you have a new boss, because no one likes having a boss anyways, you're not going to gain any friends. One of the first things bosses are taught to do is just fire someone randomly. Find the worst worker, even if they're a good worker, they're just the worst one, and fire them, because now everyone essentially fears you, and they, because you weren't going to get that love anyways, right? So now people are going to do what you say because they know you're serious. You're not a pushover. And again, if you're going to spend resources to kind of win this loyalty, then you're going to have less resources to reward the people that helped you from the beginning, right? Because the stability or to keep the province is more important than pleasing people that helped you. And it's kind of a double bind, because the people support you, so they don't want to turn against you, but they might do things that undermine your stability or rule, but you can't really drop the hammer on them because they were the ones that helped you, right? So there's kind of another kind of problem that Machiavelli talks about. So the examples I have here, and since we have military members in class, we know the U.S. does drone strikes. That's kind of my example here. In the Middle East, but obviously with these kind of drone strikes, there's collateral damage. You might legitimately kill a terrorist, but you might kill the innocent kid or a family that weren't terrorists, that had nothing to do with it, right? So again, the United States has created enemies by its actions, even though it was like not out there to kill innocent people. And so this is why there's a lot of people who are against the use of drone strikes. So they seem much more indiscriminate than they say soldiers going into a village. But then again, the American people don't want soldiers to die going to these villages. So you're in this kind of catch-22 in the American rulership case. Do we do something cheaper by using drones? Do we do something that saves more lives using drones? Or do we risk the blood of our countrymen to go and kind of solve these problems, right? And then here on the right, we have from the 60s, which I'm sure we have veterans protests today, but wounded veterans, right, where it's like they weren't getting the resources. And particularly in the case of Vietnam, the country kind of did not treat Vietnam vets well because of all the politics going on at the time. But yeah, it's like, these are the people that help us to achieve the foreign policy objectives. But then when they come home, like, are we doing enough to reward them for their effort, right? And that's kind of Machiavelli's point. Like, it doesn't seem like it's going to be enough, right, for the sacrifice. And so maybe you have family members that have served or are a member that served and are aware of some of these issues, right? So even from, I think it's still section 3, we have some pretty brutal advice from Machiavelli, which hopefully this one's out of date. Maybe it's not. So I would hope, if you're writing this paper, I would hope that you find this first advice not persuasive and can actually explain why. So one of the first things he talks about is, hey, you come into a place, kill the family of the previous ruler, right? Because you don't want to have someone challenge your rule down the line. If I take over a company, I'm not going to kill the family of the CEO who used to work there. He says, don't change the laws or the taxes. The ruler perhaps should go settle in the new lands, because then people can see, they're not like a distant, abstract object. You're there, the people can see you, right? So maybe that's one of the problems with, say, the American Revolution, right? The British king was not in the United States. He talks about, hey, things are going to be different when you take over a land that has a different language and different culture. Again, that even could be up here, right? Service members have to kind of learn about the cultural differences when they go to these places, because that matters in how you interact and are able to achieve objectives, use power in these circumstances. Again, this is a little different, more anachronistic. Send colonies of your people to the conquered lands of different languages and customs, right? So why would I do that? people that have my customs, that speak my language, that are going to support me, I put them there to kind of have a power base or a political support in these areas, right? So it'd be weird if in these kind of recent conflicts in, say, Iraq, if, the United States said, hey, we need 500,000 Americans to kind of move to Baghdad because we kind of want to have this more stability there. So I don't think we think in these terms anymore. But maybe you still find that persuasive. Well, what if we did do that? Then maybe a lot of these problems the U.S. faces internationally would disappear, right? Because you would have Americans everywhere. Again, playing devil's advocate, I don't necessarily believe these things. We have this section here. A government being created by the prince knows that it cannot stand without his friends and interests, and does its utmost to support him, and therefore he who would keep a city accustomed to freedom will hold it more easily by means of its citizens than by any other way. So again, keeping the people happy, kind of going back to our Greek readings, by allowing freedom to take place, it does seem like you have much more stability, generally speaking. Although, we know North Korea doesn't have that kind of freedom, and they seem, for the most part, pretty stable, but that's also achieved by essentially starving the populace to death. So, yeah, I don't know. In section 6, Machiavelli makes the observation that an innovator of new laws and policies will always have a difficult time. This is because they make enemies, they should say of anyone. They make enemies of anyone that is vested in the old established order. What is that? And I think this makes sense, but again, I don't know if the observation necessarily holds true. So I think he's right that people with new ideas and challenging the status quo create enemies. This insight, I think, also applies to, say, non-military oriented politics. So again, it's not just martial power, I think, which I have my examples below. It's also just people with new ideas about, say, social justice, social equality, and equity. People that often challenge the status quo, even if it's just ideas. I guess I mean here simply ideas. Are often castigated, shunned, or even killed, right? So again, here from Machiavelli. Hence, it is that all armed prophets have conquered, and the unarmed ones have been destroyed. So people who have the ability to defend themselves, that are using military might, endure, and those that don't have access to that or don't use those tools get destroyed. Besides the reasons mentioned, the nature of people is variable, and whilst it is easy to persuade them, it is difficult to fix them in a persuasion, and thus people are fickle, they change their minds. And thus it is necessary to take such measures that when they believe no longer, it may be possible to make them believe by force. So very un-American, very un-liberal in the kind of contemporary sense. But it's like, yeah, like when the people decide that they've changed their mind, and you as the ruler know they're wrong, you have the force of arms to convince them otherwise. Again, that's kind of very much in line with, like, say, Maoist communist thought. The people don't necessarily know what's best, and so the party does, and the party's going to drag you along through force. I think I can find a quotation, but Mao basically says that explicitly. So does Machiavelli's observation hold true if we consider the historical figures above? This right here is Galileo. It would have been around the time of Machiavelli writing, right? But so he challenged the Catholic Church the way Augustine was talking about it, and saying that the earth was not the center of the universe. And so this is considered heretical because the teachings of the church came from God, and God's not wrong. So if the teachings of God can't be wrong either. And so Galileo was imprisoned, and in hindsight, we know he was correct, right? So he didn't seem to have like a happy kind of life. Justice wasn't served, and he wasn't using force of arms. Here we have George Washington, a revolutionary challenging the British status quo. But unlike Galileo, and we'll get to Dr. King, he used force of arms. So the British tried to kill him. They tried to hold him as a traitor, but we won the revolution, right? So he kind of ushered in and was the father of the country. This kind of new way of thinking of liberal rights, protections, and modern capitalism. And he did endure, right? But again, I think Galileo's ideas endured. The American, country has endured. So the people may not have the same outcome, but is that what we're concerned with regards to Machiavelli? Is it just the people or the ideas? And that brings us to the last case, right? I think Dr. King died in his 30s, I think, right? But again, like clearly his legacy has lived on. But he was assassinated for his ideas, right? I could have put Gandhi up there. Gandhi was also assassinated, right? So people who oftentimes challenge the status quo get killed. And even with him, because of his work, he knew there were threats on his life for much of his adult life. Like, he wasn't like, when he was assassinated, it was a surprise. Like, he was constantly under threat of death, and he persisted. And his death made the country better, or I guess not his death, but his life made the country better. Had he lived, I'm sure the country would have solved even more of these kind of racial problems that we're now facing in the open today. So that's just food for thought, because clearly, again, another way of thinking about it is Dr. King kind of won, but you have to do that through force of arms. And again, he actually didn't advocate for force of arms. He said non-violent resistance is the way to go. And again, I think that's also part of the reason why his message has been so useful, and we kind of need to hear it more now than ever. So, I don't know, food for thought for you guys. Here we have the next section of the first part. One morning, he assembled the people and the Senate of Syracuse, talking about this historical leader that decided to have an effective rulership, as if he had to discuss things relating to them of the Republic. And at a given signal, the soldiers killed all the senators and the richest people of the town. These dead, he sees, the people being dead, he sees and held the princedom of what city without any civil commotion. So yeah, like, you just kind of find your enemies and then kill them in one fell swoop is effective. Maybe not changing their minds. So again, is this persuasive or not? I don't know. There is no, and again, in class it says, was it persuasive then? If we did this in class, is it persuasive now? The question is more open-ended, like, just, is it persuasive? So you will provide the context. Like, it is, it was, it is, it currently is, it was then, it is now persuasive. But obviously, if a new president, say Biden, came into power and he just killed all the Republicans, I think there would be a civil war. I don't think we would find that legitimate anymore. Hence, it is to be remarked that in seizing a state, the usurper ought to examine closely into all those injuries which it is necessary for him to inflict, and to do them at all in one stroke, as to not have to repeat them daily. And thus, by not unsettling men, he will have been able to reassure them and win them, so that the people himself by benefits. He who does otherwise, either from timidity or evil advice, is always compelled to keep the knife in his hand. Neither can he rely on his subjects, nor can they attach themselves to him, owing their continued and repeated wrongs. For injuries ought to be done all at one time, I think is the message there. And obviously, Machiavelli gives his historical examples of people doing these things. But here I have newspapers clippings from the 30s from Hitler. So again, the Night of the Long Knives is an actual 3-day event that took place from June 30th to July 2nd, 1934 in Germany, where Hitler killed all of his remaining rivals to power, right? So it's a kind of this famous case of what Machiavelli is talking about. Just do it all at once, and then we know obviously Hitler was able to gain control of Germany and do all the terrible things he did. And I can't really see these pictures, but here's this guy could have taken over the Nazi party. His name was Ernst Röhm, and Hitler used him to become successful, but once his kind of political power started to match Hitler's, Hitler killed him. Here we got section 11. It is to be added also that the prince can never secure himself against a hostile people because of there being too many, whilst there be from nobles, blah, 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 blah. But hostile nobles. So yeah, he basically is saying here in this clip, you don't want to piss off people. You don't want to act in a way that's going to essentially undermine your stability. You want to act essentially justly, speaking back to the Greeks. And so, because if you upset the people, you will not be able to rule. They'll revolt against you, and you'll be done. Couldn't find the best clip. This is from Kingdom of Heaven, when the Crusaders are going to lose the city of Jerusalem, and the character Balian says, you guys could come in and kill everyone. We did when we took over the city. And the Saladin, the Muslim leader's like, no, I'm not going to do that. That wouldn't be justice, right? I'm going to let all you and your people go, because he wants to have this kind of order and be respected. So is he following the will of God? Probably, from his interpretation, and does this produce the best outcome? I think so. Therefore, a wise prince ought to adopt such a course that his citizens will always, in every sort and kind of circumstance, have need of the state and of him, and they will always find them faithful, right? So again, like what Machiavelli is saying is that in this kind of quote is that the people in power also want to be useful, because if you are useful, then the people will have need of you. If you're just stealing people's money and not helping them solve problems, then they're just going to get rid of you, right? And so being a use to the people is a sure way of having them have loyalty to you, right? Because you are solving problems. You're not promising to solve problems, you're actually doing it. And you can tell I got really bored reading this. The reading is long. Skim it, skip over the historical examples. It's a lot. But Machiavelli talks about defense. So again, he really talks about how in these last couple sections, it's important for a ruler to actually have essentially military knowledge, maybe even military experience, right? And so one of these first things he talks about is defense. We need to have a strong defense. President Trump kind of talks about this with regards to having a wall or whatever. But here I have a picture of President Reagan from the 80s and his Star Wars missile defense. The idea being like if America has this, futuristic capability of shooting out missiles from space with lasers or whatever he was saying, then it will be a deterrent from the Russians to try and attack us, right? So basically by having strong defense, a leader prevents the undermining of his or her rulership. And again, that idea is not too foreign, even though this was, 30 years ago? Now we have Space Force, which is we're starting to get more into space. The Chinese are going to go to the moon. We're supposed to go to Mars. Maybe we actually need a military apparatus that can function in space. And so, America is continuing to kind of have its defensive or possibly offensive capabilities, right? But I think this is in line with what Machiavelli's saying. And this is the last kind of part where he talks about, again, that leaders need to have this kind of military prowess. And many of essentially the American presidents anyways, and many leaders around the world in the past did have this kind of military prowess. There are more leaders in the American history that had military experience, right? We obviously have two important ones. Ulysses S. Grant was a president, but he was also head of the Union Army during the Civil War and brought that war to a conclusion with the Union victory, right? Dwight Eisenhower, you guys should know, was actually lived in Palm Desert when he retired from office. That's why a lot of the things like the medical center north of campus is named the Dwight Eisenhower, Medical Center in Rancho Mirage. But he was the head of the Allied forces in Europe, right? So he was he helped organize, D-Day, the invasion of France. And then I have here, maybe not people who had so much responsibility as these figures who would have been, top tier generals organizationally, knowing how people work, knowing how strategy works, kind of human psychology. Here we have JFK, John F. Kennedy, a president. He was a war hero. His boat was blew up in the Pacific Ocean on a mission. He hurt his back. He was actually hurt through his presidency. He died pretty young, in his 40s from an assassination. But he had that military experience, but was considered a hero. And same thing with George H.W. Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41. He was considered a war hero. He was an aviator, Navy aviator in World War II. He was shot down, and so he had that experience of knowing what it takes to kind of sacrifice the individual anxiety and fears and pride that someone in the service is going to have using this kind of martial force. But again, many of these Machiavellian lessons don't just apply to that type of martial force, but he is concerned with it because his world revolved around it. Like I said, I think if you're thinking about persuasiveness, again, many contemporary corporate people use this kind of logic to motivate workers or how to beat the other company in making a product or something like that. So that's our Machiavelli notes. I will leave it to you to go through the second half of the reading. We can talk about them in class, obviously, but I'm not going to have notes on it. And with regards to advice, you want to get advice from the second half. Obviously, you can't find anything, you can use some of these points I used out in the first half. But in terms of the paper, I'm looking for second half, persuasive arguments and points and observations that Machiavelli's making in the second half. So I just did that mostly to kind of save myself a headache. But obviously, I've read all of this before. I'm capable of discussing it, but I didn't want to really have this kind of detailed discussion. This thing took forever. So hopefully this is making sense. Hopefully you guys have good questions. And if it's not making sense, that's fine. Please ask me that stuff. You don't have to get this. That's one more video down, a couple more to go, more notes to go. And I will see you guys in class in the next video.